So Dr. Phil is going to talk about the very easy and non-controversial topic of...
Who wrote Ephesians? Thank you, Ruth. We've been to Ephesus 3 times together, and every time we see something new, and it's really opened our eyes. I'm going to ask you to... Okay, authority in the New Testament and letter to the Ephesians. I'm Phil Quanbeck II. I realized one thing I enjoyed. I watched last week's presentation on YouTube with Dr. Mary Hinkle-Thor, and that was very helpful to me, and I like what we're doing. And I brought some WD-40 for the chairs right by the video camera. And I will try to keep my tics at a minimum during this presentation. But this is wonderful that we're doing this. I really like our emphasis on media. So just to affirm that. You can email me at quanbeck@augsburg.edu. If you have problems with my presentation, then email Pastor Vern at zumbrellegion.org. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, some of these things might be repetitive, but they bear repeating. There are 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament, and 1/4 of the New Testament is either attributed to Paul or about him. What does that tell you about Paul's role in the early church? Yeah, he's big, but not without controversy. 7, as scholars like to say, are undisputedly by Paul himself. 3 are disputed, that is, there's disagreement. There are good people like me who think he didn't write some, and there are bad people, you know, it's more complicated than that. And there are 3 very unlikely by Paul. Let's go to the... here I've listed the 13 letters in canonical order, and they are arranged by size, length, because the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament are in fact scrolls, not bound books, codices as they came to be called. And so you could fit several letters on one scroll, and things like Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians needed something longer. The red books are the ones that are disputed: Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians. So there are genuine arguments to be made both ways about those, and Ephesians, is in the disputed list. The green, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are also called the pastoral epistles. They're of a different quality altogether. If I have time, I'll talk about that. A very small number of New Testament scholars or biblical scholars across the board think those are, by Paul himself. They seem to reflect a different time, different issues, and as I'll point out later, they don't even bring up some of the issues that are common to Romans and 1 Corinthians and the epistles you know and love, and even Ephesians. Ancient debates. This matter of who wrote things. We have lots of examples of books that were written under other people's names. And the question is this deception or is it imitation? Sometimes it might, deception, we put a negative quality on that term because, someone's trying to masquerade, and you can write under someone else's name in order to undermine their thought or to suggest something that that person didn't say. Or imitation, we could say, is also an attempt to adapt, change, and continue the work of someone. Elvis imitators come to mind. We know they're not Elvis. But what do they do? Keep the tradition alive and reinterpret it. And you have different periods of Elvis. I won't go on at length about this, and I no longer, do that. Ancient debates. We have the simple fact of the problem of manuscripts. You carry Bibles, and you live with the illusion that the Bible's always looked like that. In the early years of the church, well into the 2nd century, there is no New Testament. There are manuscripts floating around, like this. What do you notice about the manuscript portrayed here? It's not complete. There are holes in it. And so sometimes, and some very able scholars will take manuscripts and then they'll say, well, it must have included this in here. And often they're right, and sometimes they're not. The earliest manuscripts of what we call the Gospels have no names on them. There's no Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John on the earliest manuscripts of the Gospels. So what do we conclude from that? They're added later. In part because there's this quest for authority, because what do you want your Gospels to be reliant on? Eyewitnesses, apostolic traditions. So we look for that. The ending of the Gospel of Mark. Let's go to the next one, I think. Mark 16:9 through 20. This is where you have all the snake handling and the drinking of poison and stuff like that. It's not in the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark. So which Mark do you read? If you look at your NRSV or NIV, you'll find that those last verses of the Gospel of Mark are in double brackets. That is, they're not thought to be the earliest manuscript. So, how do we judge the authority of Mark? I will bring out snakes at the end of this, and we'll see, if it works. So the ancient debate, it included what's in and what's out of the canon. And to bear, maybe I've said this before, there is no New Testament in the New Testament period. The oldest books of the New Testament are the letters of Paul, and if there was anything traveling around in the first century, it was probably Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians. The Gospels come later, as far as we can tell. I'll just go back one. And there are disputes as to what's in and what's out. In the 2nd century, a lot of people thought the Shepherd of Hermas was really good. And I know you all studied that in confirmation. No, you didn't. You haven't heard of it. And if you read it now, you think, that is odd. But 2nd century Christians drew inspiration from it. For them, it was an inspired piece of literature. But then it wore out. It was no longer as useful. But other works survive. And so there's a test of time. And the New Testament comes together over time and is pieced together. It takes shape. It doesn't just happen. And another claim about the New Testament, all the books in the New Testament are believed to be written by human authors. That's why there are names attached to them all. As distinct from, let's say, the Quran, which is said to be revealed and then transcribed. The New Testament is always attributed to human authorship. We can deal with the issue of inspiration later, but there is always this agency of the experience of the church that writes things down and preserves them. Okay. So, as we read the letters of Paul, one of the things that, if you really start reading things, you ever notice that when you really read something carefully or read it several times, you start noticing things you didn't see on the first time through? Like all those contracts you get with your credit cards? Or the end user agreements you signed for Microsoft? Yeah, you haven't read those. So. In the undisputed letters of Paul, that is, and I'll have you recite these again, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon you talked about last week. Paul never uses the word Peter. He always talks about Cephas. He uses the word Satan, but never the devil. And he talks about the parousia, that end-time return. In other letters, like Ephesians and Colossians, he'll refer to Peter, not Cephas, the devil, not Satan, and the epiphania, that is the appearance, instead of the parousia, the return. So what's one question you would ask when you start running into vocabulary changes? An honest question. Let's say you get a student turns in a paper, and this person hasn't really been able to construct sentences all semester, and all of a sudden, you have this fluent piece of work using polysyllabic terms. Yeah, you question authorship. So this is not, people do change terms. They do change ideas, but it just says, Peter here, Cephas here. Satan here, the devil here. You notice those things. And there are ancient debates. Clement of Alexandria in the early 2nd century, late 1st, early 2nd century, is collecting stuff. And he's writing lists. He says, I got these letters here, they're pretty good. They're pretty inspired, and then I got some other stuff that's not so. He kind of ranks them. Because there is no New Testament yet. What's he doing? He's kind of rating the material. It's kind of like 4-star, 3-star. He's the IMDb of the 2nd century. Marcion of Sinope in the mid-2nd century, around 150. He's the one who first starts collecting. He likes Paul. Mostly. And then he cuts out the stuff he doesn't like. He's got 10 letters of Paul that he likes, 3 that he doesn't. Most of the Gospels stink in his judgment, and parts of Luke. So that's what he does. So what is he doing? He's kind of selecting. He's editing, selecting, adding, removing. And then 2 Peter, that book attributed to Peter, not by Peter, I'm sorry to say, says the letters of Paul are difficult to understand. What does that tell you? Well, it's not Peter, but someone's reading Paul and saying, this is tough stuff. But it tells us within the New Testament there's commentary on other parts of what come to be the New Testament. He says, the letters of Paul are difficult to understand, and some people, they take advantage of those who are not as smart and tend to, distort the message. So there's even a warning within the New Testament itself about the difficulty of interpretation.